Before we get started, there will be spoilers for the 1000-year Blood War arc of Bleach in the video to come. When it comes to the captains of the Gotei 13, there are few we know better than Kenpachi Zaraki and Byakuya Kuchiki. They're both completely iconic, of course, totally synonymous with the series, and within the story of Bleach, both characters get huge roles to play and are heavily exposed to the audience. Aside from perhaps Hitsugaya, they're the two captains with the most to do. They're also famously bitter rivals representing different sides of the same coin. One, the aristocratic aloof noble with a stature that lifts him above the clouds. The other, a brutal savage barbarian who spends his days knee-deep in the dirt and the blood. But in today's video, I want to ask the question, are Kenpachi and Byakuya the same character? Now, of course, they're not literally the same character, but they both embark on extremely similar, almost mirrored, reflected journeys throughout the story of Bleach. They walk, unknowingly, the same path thanks to their proximity to Ichigo. Something doesn't happen to one of them without then happening to the other later on down the line, like clockwork. So, to answer this question, we're going to have a look at the respective development of both captains from the start of Bleach right the way through to the very end. Just how similar actually are their journeys, their arcs. So, without further ado, let's take a look at Bleach's two biggest captains from arc to arc. Did Kubo place them on parallel paths, the two of them destined to walk the same road? Or am I just imagining things? As we begin with the agent of the Shinigami Arc, perhaps expectedly, the mirroring of Byakuya and Kenpachi's respective paths doesn't really begin to take shape until the next major arc, the Soul Society arc. After all, Byakuya is initially given much more prominence, entering the story early as the main antagonist and the object of Ichigo's ambition. Despite the entire Gotei 13 theoretically standing in his way, Byakuya is the target Ichigo needs to defeat in order to really save Rukia, at least from a narrative perspective. And yet the burgeoning rivalry that boils between the two captains actually begins as early as chapter 65, at the end of the Agent of the Shinigami arc, yet still very much within it. Kenpachi, along with Gin, is introduced before the rest of the captains, with sparks flying between him and Byakuya as early as here. Byakuya clearly looks down upon Kenpachi's commoner background with disdain, and Kenpachi seems to be chomping at the bit for the chance to do battle with the aristocrat. While this is the absolute earliest example, it's cool to already see their relationship taking place and already begin to see the way Kubo is singling these two out to be mirrored images of one another. Now though, when we get to the Soul Society arc, things really begin to start slotting into place. As far as Ichigo is concerned, Byakuya remains the ultimate target, the endgame. He is the unreachable summit that Ichigo must eventually learn bankai in order to defeat. But before that, Ichigo comes up against another captain in bloody combat, wherein he learns a valuable lesson, and of course I'm talking about Kenpachi. Here, although Kenpachi is considerably weaker than he would later turn out to be, he still pushes Ichigo to grow and evolve in their battle, and Ichigo takes major steps in both of his milestone fights against Kenpachi and Byakuya in this arc. From his duel with Kenpachi, Ichigo's bond with Old Man Zangetsu deepens, as does his understanding of his own power. Meanwhile, from his later battle with Byakuya, the relationship between Ichigo and, at this point in time, the seemingly malevolent entity White begins to awaken with life-changing ramifications for the future. Now, if this were the only arc in Bleach, it would be safe to say that there isn't really any kind of reflection going on, there's no mirroring here. It's a pretty standard narrative structure in this regard, that Ichigo has two major touchstone moments against major enemies, and he grows and learns from each, and there aren't really any similarities between Kenpachi and Byakuya and the way they are portrayed, the way their story plays out, outside of those respective roles. And so in that regard, there's not too much then to say about the Soul Society arc, because we're really just laying the foundations. The mirrored paths of Byakuya and Kenpachi span the entire storyline, so for now it's best to just remember what's happened so far. Both Kenpachi and Byakuya have been major obstacles for Ichigo, and both have proven vital to his overall growth and development. As such, he's developed early relationships with both of them as well, and those relationships will continue to grow and flourish in numerous ways. But it should be noted as well before we move on that the mirroring of these two characters extends well beyond just Ichigo's own personal journey. The impact Kenpachi and Byakuya have on the narrative, both surrounding Ichigo and outside of him, runs parallel too, right the way down to their individual fights and the way they're presented. So, during the earliest stages of the Arrancar Arc, the Gotei 13 is absent, deciding to steer mostly clear of the initial invasions outside of Hitsugaya's advance team. When Yamamoto orders Ichigo to stand down after Orihime's kidnapping, it's Byakuya and Kenpachi who are sent to retrieve the advance team to prevent any insubordination from boiling up. Much later, though, when the Gotei 13 gets involved in the battles in Wako Mundo, the roles are reversed from what we saw in the Soul Society arc. This time, while both Byakuya and Kenpachi still get major battles against the Espada, Byakuya has both a less important part to play, battling a weaker Espada over a much shorter period of time, and less of a proximity to Ichigo, not even meeting him again until the fake Karakura Town arc. So this time round, it's Kenpachi's chance to shine as he rescues Ichigo from the hero's lowest point yet. Having been brutally ambushed by Neutra and Tesla, Ichigo is near death as Tesla ravages him with his resurrection, pushing Ichigo to the limit as Orihime and Nell are forced to watch in horror. With Ichigo's bones being broken and his body tossed around like a rag doll, it looks like it's all over for our main character, until Kenpachi steps in out of nowhere, not only blocking Tesla's fist with his blade, but then killing the Fraction with a single swipe of his sword. And so from then onwards, Kenpachi's vicious battle with Neutra is clearly designed to be the highlighted spectacle, the standout of this series of fights, taking place last and over the longest stretch of chapters. But not only that, Ichigo is also there to bear witness to the fight as well after Kenpachi saves his life, while the other Captain vs Espada battles take place in kind of isolated pockets of story elsewhere in the narrative. And so what we're seeing here is an inverse of their roles from the Soul Society arc. Now, of course, the roles are naturally going to feel different anyway, due to the fact the Gotei 13 are now on Ichigo's side, but regardless, the effect is clear. This time, it's Kenpachi who gets to be the biggest player in Ichigo's journey, but crucially, both captains are still here, and they're both still having an effect on the larger war at hand. And then, as the Arrancar arc comes to a close, both Kenpachi and Byakuya are reunited on a level playing field once again, the two of them meeting up with Ichigo at the same time to help take on Yami. And so you can see how Kubo is playing a balancing act with the representation of these two captains. After their roles were switched moving into the Wako Mundo arc, they're now both back to an even place once again. Kenpachi has the bigger impact on the fight with Yami, but Byakuya plays the bigger role in Ichigo's personal journey. While Kenpachi takes on the Espada in a bloody bout, Byakuya demonstrates his incredible character development by leaving charge of Karakura to Ichigo, legitimizing him as a part of the Gotei 13 and showing how much the captain of the 6th Division has changed. Of course, the two captains eventually meet on the battlefield anyway, with their rivalry bubbling to the surface once more, to the point where it looks like they may even lock blades themselves, but the two of them eventually work together to kill Yami for good as the Arrancar arc ends. And so, as we reach the Lost Agent arc, after the time skip, we've left the two captains in a pretty equal place on their respective journeys. Byakuya had the bigger, part to play in the Soul Society arc, but that was then switched up with Kenpachi come the Arrancar Arc, with the other captain in these respective examples playing a smaller yet still impactful role alongside the other. So, what can the Lost Agent arc offer us in this examination? An arc where the Gotei 13 are almost completely missing for the entire time? Well, quite a lot, as it turns out. As the final act of the arc begins, Ichigo once again hits his lowest point ever. Now, since his beatdown at the hands of Tesla, Ichigo has been killed by Ulquiorra, which I reckon he probably considers his lowest point, but that was one where he and Zangetsu essentially got themselves out of it together. In both the Tesla situation before us and now this, which is more of an emotional low point, Ichigo has nowhere else to turn, seemingly. I guess what I'm saying is in both of these examples, help comes from an outside source. In a dramatic, wonderful sequence that I praised as one of Bleach's best ever scenes, Ginjo betrays Ichigo, stealing his hard-earned Fullbring and leaving him sobbing in the rain, powerless and destitute. However, at the last second, the Gotei 13 returns to rescue him, heralded by the appearance of Kisuke, Isshin and Rukia, who restore Ichigo's powers to him. In that moment, several familiar faces arrive on the scene to do battle with Ginjo and Execution, and of course, Byakuya and Kenpachi are among the gathering Shinigami. Due to their relationship with Ichigo, but also their prior importance in the story in both major arcs to date, there was no way one of them was going to be left out. Except this time, the roles are reversed once again from the Arrancar arc. While Kenpachi tries to face off with Tsukishima, it's actually Byakuya who ends up taking him on. Not only is Tsukishima the secondary main antagonist of the entire arc, and the main antagonist right the way up until the reveal of Ginjo's betrayal, but he's also the one who has hurt Ichigo the most. Sure, Ginjo's betrayal was the final nail in the coffin, and really he's the one who engineered everything, but it was Tsukishima and his Book of the End that was so absolutely terrifying, that completely turns Ichigo's world upside down. Byakuya being the one to face Tsukishima then is a huge deal for the captain, giving him the second biggest fight of the entire arc, and perhaps ultimately the most satisfying one for the fans. The battle is yet another showcase of Byakuya's continued growth and his respect for Ichigo, and highlights the pain Tsukishima has caused Ichigo as really the underlying reason for not only wanting to kill him in the end, but for Tsukishima's power not having the desired effect on Byakuya, even if it does work. Meanwhile, while Kenpachi is present for this fight, he has considerably less of a role to play. Kenpachi's battle against Giriko is the first one of the bunch, and the captain just cuts the Fullbringer in two instantly. Again, quite satisfying, but not particularly important in the grand scheme of things, certainly not compared to Byakuya's fight. And so, looking at their parallel development, I'd say Byakuya is back on top now after the Lost Agent arc. But it's clear Kubo wanted these two captains to appear very similar in both the roles they play in Bleach and their relationship to Ichigo. But as we move now into the 1000-Year Blood War arc, this is where the similarities become the most pronounced. It's here that both characters are unshackled somewhat from Ichigo, and instead their roles affect the Gotei 13, the Soul Society, and the wider war itself. As the Vandenreich invade for the first time, the Gotei 13 is mobilized for battle, intercepting the Quincy's in the very streets of the Seirete. Byakuya and Renji challenge Asnot and Masked Masculine, but Byakuya's bankai is stolen, leading to perhaps the most devastating defeat of the entire series, certainly one of them. Byakuya is not only humbled, he's nearly killed by the Stern Ritter, who pulverizes him with the stolen bankai, eviscerating his insides and leaving him for dead. Immediately after this, as if to try and lift the spirits of the readers, Kenpachi arrives on the scene, carrying 3 dead Stern Ritter upon his back. It's a brief moment of triumph, a reprieve amidst the horror, but again it's short-lived. For the next time we see Kenpachi, he too has suffered a spectacular defeat. The fearsome captain is being held aloft by the throat, even with his eye patch off. He's been beaten into submission, falling into a coma as Royd Lloyd mocks his weakness. It's not quite as bad or as dire as Byakuya's near-death experience, but it's still a shocking display for one of the most powerful Shinigami of them all. One thing that's important to remember here as we witness both Byakuya and Kenpachi at death's door, essentially, is that both Byakuya and Kenpachi are very prevalent captains, both in-universe and out of it. In-universe, Byakuya is well respected and well known as the model Shinigami that all should aspire to be, and is the face of Soul Society authority, while Kenpachi is the man who doesn't fall in battle no matter what, a legendary demon with the sword. Kubo has trained us as readers to feel the same way about these characters over the years. When they step into battle, we expect them to be able to handle it. Even if the fight is tough, they almost always make it out the other side. Here, though, in the first Quincy invasion, they both fall dramatically, and that shakes the foundations of what we thought we knew. Admittedly, Byakuya does get one last moment with Ichigo that is truly incredible. As the captain waits to die, surrounded by a pool of his own blood, he acknowledges Ichigo as the only one who can save the Soul Society, passing the torch to him in an immaculate sequence that's absolutely one of the best of the entire series. It's cool because this feels like a meta way for Kubo to, as I said earlier, unshackle Byakuya. Later on, Kenpachi gets his own moment that's very similar to this, so for now it's unshackling Byakuya from Ichigo's development. With tears in his eyes, Byakuya asks Ichigo, who he acknowledges shouldn't even be there, to do what he couldn't and protect the Soul Society. It's a beautiful moment. And so, with the first Quincy invasion now behind us, both Byakuya and Kenpachi were totally devastated by the Sternritter, but at least Kenpachi took 3 of them down with him. Now, though, the mirroring of the two characters continues. Both of them receive immeasurable new power-ups in the wake of the battle, with Byakuya being taken to the royal palace to receive divine training, while Kenpachi at last learns the name of his Zanpakuto after battling Unohana, all the while lifting his own self-imposed limits to unlock his true strength. They both arrive in the second Quincy invasion late, and yet far more powerful than they were before. Byakuya's role is definitely diminished a bit in comparison to Kenpachi's here. It reminds me a little actually of how Kubo handled the two characters in the Fate Karakura Town arc. Byakuya's part to play is much more character-driven, as he intervenes in Rukia's battle with Asnot to give her the drive she needs to perform bankai and kill the Sternritter. While on the other hand, Kenpachi engages in a massive spectacle of a fight against an extraordinarily powerful enemy, revealing his Shikai and obliterating a huge meteor in what amounts to an incredible event. Kenpachi's journey and development with his Zanpakuto is definitely given more prominence than anything of Byakuya's at this point in the story, with the 11th Division captain receiving essentially a self-contained developmental arc from start to finish, all within the 1000-Year Blood War arc alone. Both characters then meet Ichigo again on the field of battle, though the changes in Ichigo's character are extremely obvious now, and that's reflected in the roles the captains play. I mentioned earlier, when Byakuya was on his deathbed, that Kenpachi had a scene analogous to that, and this is it, though again, nowhere near as dire. Ichigo coming to Kenpachi's rescue not only references Kenpachi saving him way back in the Arrancar Arc, but it does mirror his meeting with Byakuya in the first Quincy invasion, where he once battled both of these captains and then later sought their respect and approval, something that seemed to be a mountainous, if not impossible, task. Now in the 1000-Year Blood War arc, he's really surpassed them both, and is now coming to both of their sides as they teeter on the brink of death in one form or another. Ultimately, Ichigo rescuing Kenpachi is played far more triumphantly than his downtrodden, rain-soaked meeting with Byakuya, but they are similar scenes nonetheless. Ichigo's visible growth is an aspect of Kenpachi and Byakuya's mirrored development that I really like. I love how we see his gradual arc. I love how both characters act as a form of springboard for him, and how he eventually trades places with them and even leaves them behind. Byakuya later comes to assist Ichigo against the Stern Ritter, and although they don't talk, he and his bankai provide a means for escape for our main character as he rushes to challenge Arc. And yet, Kubo isn't finished with mirroring Kenpachi and Byakuya just yet. With Kenpachi battered by the Bambis, it's now time for Byakuya to have his triumphant moment. Where Kenpachi killed 3 Stern Ritter in the first invasion, Byakuya now takes on 5 at once with his newfound powers, remaining completely untouched, and defeating 3 of them with ease, barely even moving as he takes each of them out without so much as breaking a sweat. The effect is even more pronounced in the source material, where we suddenly cut to Byakuya having taken 3 of them out, in a very similar way to the hard cut to Kenpachi with 3 corpses on his back. Byakuya's resulting battle against Pepe is undeniably both smaller in scope and frankly worse than Kenpachi's fight with Gremi, but in that sense it feels like another reflection of the Waco Mundo arc. And then we reach their final battle of the 1,000-Year Blood War and of the series so far, when the captains take on Gerard Valkyrie in an all-out showdown. Kenpachi, Byakuya, and Hitsugaya all come together to fight this Goliath, and while Hitsugaya's inclusion is inconsequential here to this video, both Kenpachi and Byakuya take on Gerard at the same time, finally getting the chance to go up against an opponent together on screen. Kenpachi has one last massive reveal, the unveiling of his surprise bankai, bringing to a close the story of his Zanpakuto in the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, which began and has ended in this arc, or at least so far anyway. But Byakuya is the one who fights Gerard for the entirety of the battle, from beginning right the way through to the very end. He is the only character who is there from start to finish, and even reveals a new upgraded ability of Senkei in an effort to try and bring things to close. Ultimately, while Kenpachi's bankai is undeniably the bigger reveal, both captains actually end up having a similar impact on this unkillable Quincy Golem before the war finally comes to an end. And so, there you have it. Did I convince you that Kenpachi and Byakuya are essentially the same character? Obviously that's a joke, but their paths, their stories, they are very similar, working in tandem to help push Ichigo to become the man he's meant to be, while also growing themselves. Their roles reverse with each arc, but crucially you can see that neither captain is ever left behind. Neither captain never has nothing to do. As I mentioned earlier, when something happens to one of them, or when one of them does something, it will invariably happen to the other one as well later on down the line. But that's it for the video, guys. As always, I really hope you enjoyed it. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. I'd love to hear if you think I'm right about this, if Kenpachi and Byakuya do clearly share a mirrored parallel development that does seem to both lift Ichigo up and then eventually allow him to kind of surpass them, while also giving them both a similar level of prominence from arc to arc, with their roles reversing within each different arc to kind of give them both a relatively even amount of time to shine. Or am I totally off base and was this just a nonsense ramble? Do please let me know your thoughts down in the comments. And as always, I want to end the video by giving a massive shout out and saying a huge thank you to my wonderful supporters over on Patreon. I really do appreciate each and every one of you so very much. If you like what I do here on YouTube and you want to support me as well, you can do just that to get your name in the credits like this and to receive every video I release absolutely ad-free. Alright guys, but until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.